On October 14th, 2025, at exactly the moment most people were pouring their morning coffee, Microsoft flipped a switch that put hundreds of millions of computers around the world at risk, and most of the people sitting in front of those computers had no idea it had even happened. That was the day Windows 10 officially reached end of support. No more free security patches, no more bug fixes, no more quiet, invisible updates working in the background to keep hackers out. At the time that deadline hit, more than 60% of all Windows PCs on the planet were still running Windows 10, which means, on that single Tuesday, an operating system used by hundreds of millions of people quietly became a ticking clock. Microsoft's own executives went public with the warning. They said plainly that devices left behind would still function, but they would become increasingly vulnerable to malware and cyber attacks with every day that passed. Microsoft scrambled to offer a lifeline, a paid extended security updates program, something the company had only ever offered to big businesses before, now being opened up to everyday consumers for the very first time in its history. And even that lifeline had a catch buried in the fine print. Windows 10, home users were quietly left out unless they paid to upgrade their edition first. Community groups and consumer advocates have already started calling that paid ESU program a snooze button rather than an actual fix, because it only buys you roughly one more year before the clock runs out for good in October 2027, and the free version of the program does not even exist for everyone. Some users only qualify by syncing settings to the cloud or by redeeming Microsoft reward points instead of paying outright. If you were one of those hundreds of millions of people, and there is a very good chance you were suddenly staring down a decision you probably never expected to have to make so urgently, stay on an operating system that is now a security liability, pay Microsoft to buy yourself a little more time, upgrade to Windows 11 if your hardware even qualifies, or walk away from Windows entirely and try something else. That single deadline, that one date on the calendar, is the reason more people are asking the operating system question right now than at any point in the last decade. And I asked it too. I spent months going back and forth, Windows, then Mac, then Linux, testing each one seriously, not just poking around for an afternoon. And I finally have a definitive answer. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which one is right for you, and you will not need to watch another comparison video ever again. If you want the full breakdown, subscribe right now because this is one you do not want to miss. Let me start by telling you something most tech channels will not say. There is no single best operating system for every person on the planet, but there is a best one for you based on what you actually do, what you actually need, and what you actually want from your computer. And by the time this video ends, you will know which one that is. So let's start from the very beginning. What even is an operating system? Think of it this way. Your computer is like a house. The hardware, the processor, the RAM, the hard drive, that is the foundation, the walls, the plumbing. But a house without furniture, without lights, without a way to open the doors, that is useless. The operating system is everything that makes the house livable. It is the thing that lets you open apps, move files, connect to the internet, and do literally anything on your computer. Without it, your laptop is just an expensive paperweight. There are three main operating systems most people in the world use. Windows, made by Microsoft, macOS, made by Apple, and Linux, which is actually made by thousands of developers around the world and is completely free. These three cover almost every computer on Earth, and they are very, very different from each other. Let's talk about Windows first, because it is where most people start. Windows is still the most popular desktop operating system in the world, though its grip has loosened more in the last year than in the previous decade combined. For most of 2025, Windows was sitting comfortably above 70% of global desktop share. But by June of 2026, StatCounter's worldwide numbers showed something that had not happened in years, Windows dipping below 60%, down into the mid to high 50s depending on the exact month, with a huge and growing slice of traffic now landing in a category called unknown, largely made up of privacy tools, hardened browsers, and VPNs masking the real operating system underneath. Even accounting for that hidden chunk, which is almost certainly mostly Windows in disguise, the trend line is unmistakable. Microsoft's dominance is being chipped away for the first time in a long time. Microsoft has been building Windows since 1985, and the current version, Windows 11, was released back in October 2021. Why has Windows stayed so popular for so long? A few reasons. First, it runs on almost any hardware. Unlike macOS, which only officially runs on Apple computers, Windows runs on machines from Dell, HP, Lenovo, OnePoint Asus, Acer, Samsung, and hundreds of other manufacturers. That means an enormous range of prices to choose from, anywhere from a couple $100s to several thousand. Second, almost every piece of software ever made for desktop computers was made for Windows first. Games, business software, creative tools, engineering programs. If it exists, it almost certainly runs on Windows. Third, Most offices, schools, and businesses run Windows, so if you work at a company, there is a very high chance your work computer is running some version of it, but Windows is not perfect, not even close. The biggest issue is bloatware. Buy a new budget Windows laptop, and it often arrives preloaded with software you never asked for and never want. Antivirus trials, random branded apps, widgets that slow your system down before you have even opened a browser. Microsoft has also been pushing more ads and recommendations directly into the operating system itself, which a lot of users find genuinely annoying. Windows 11 requires you to sign into a Microsoft account just to finish setup, which raises real privacy concerns for a lot of people. Security is another sore spot. Because Windows is so popular, it is also the single biggest target for hackers, viruses, and malware on the planet. That does not automatically make Windows unsafe. If you keep it updated and use common sense, you will generally be fine, but the attack surface is bigger simply because there are more Windows machines in the world to attack, and historically, Windows has racked up more vulnerabilities than macOS or Linux. Then there is cost. A Windows 11 home license costs over $100 if bought directly from Microsoft. Most people never feel that cost directly because it comes pre-installed, but it is baked into the price of every machine you buy. And when Microsoft eventually pushes the next major version, you may need new hardware entirely if your current machine does not meet the requirements, which is exactly what happened with Windows 11's strict TPM 2.0 security chip requirement, a requirement that locked millions of perfectly functional PCs out of the free upgrade. Which brings us back to where we started, the Windows 10 end of support deadline. That October 2025 cutoff is genuinely one of the biggest forces pushing people toward alternatives right now, because for the first time in years, a huge number of Windows users are being told their otherwise perfectly good computer simply is not welcome on the new version. Now, let's talk about macOS. If Windows is the most popular, macOS is the most polished. macOS runs on Apple's Mac computers, the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, Mac Mini, Mac Studio, and Mac Pro. Its global desktop share sits somewhere in the 12 to 15% range, depending on which tracker you look at, sometimes higher when you count older OS X installations separately, which is far behind Windows but still represents hundreds of millions of computers worldwide, and notably ahead of Linux on raw desktop numbers even in 2026. Apple's approach to computing is fundamentally different from Microsoft's. Apple makes both the hardware and the software. The MacBook Pro and macOS are designed together from the ground up to work perfectly with each other, something called vertical integration, and it is the reason Macs tend to feel so smooth and reliable. There is no version of macOS trying to run on 1,000 different hardware combinations from 1,000 different manufacturers. It is built for a very specific, tightly controlled set of Apple hardware, and that makes optimization dramatically easier. The results speak for themselves. macOS is known for being extremely stable, crashing far less often than Windows, apps open quickly, and the system does not slow down over time the way Windows machines often seem to. macOS also has a strong reputation for excellent battery life, especially since Apple made its massive architectural shift starting in November 2020, replacing Intel processors with its own custom chips, beginning with the M1. Those Apple Silicon chips are ARM-based, not x86 like Intel and AMD, and the performance and efficiency shocked the entire tech industry when they landed. The M1 MacBook Air, which has no fan at all, benchmarked faster than plenty of high-end Windows laptops running active cooling. Battery life on these machines routinely hit 15, 17, even 20 hours in real-world use. By 2026, Apple has pushed several generations further with the M4 family, and the gap in efficiency between Apple Silicon and traditional x86 laptops remains one of the most talked about stories in the entire industry. So why doesn't everyone just buy a Mac? Two main reasons: cost and gaming. Cost first. Entry-level Macs still start in the $500 to $600 range for something like a Mac Mini, and MacBook Air pricing typically starts north of $1,000. Compare that to a Windows laptop that can be had for $200 or $300, and the gap is enormous. If you are a student, or you live somewhere where $1,000 is a significant amount of money, the price difference matters enormously. macOS is essentially a premium product. You get a lot for the money, excellent build quality, strong performance, long software support, but you have to be able to afford the entry point in the first place. Then there's gaming, and this remains macOS's single biggest weakness. The Mac gaming library is dramatically smaller than what is available on Windows. Most major PC titles are built for Windows first, and plenty never come to Mac at all. Apple has been trying to close that gap, pushing its own Metal graphics framework, working with studios to bring more titles over, and the M-series chips are genuinely impressive at graphics performance on paper. But if you want the newest 808 blockbuster releases the day they drop, you want a Windows machine, full stop. macOS is also very tightly locked into the wider Apple ecosystem. If you already own an iPhone, an iPad, or an AIM, Apple Watch, macOS works beautifully alongside all of them. AirDrop, handoff, universal control, iMessage right on your desktop. It all just works seamlessly. Step outside that ecosystem, and some of that magic disappears. And Apple's update policy, while genuinely generous compared to a lot of the industry, does eventually cut older. Machines off, a Mac from the late 2010s can no longer install the newest macOS release, which means it slowly falls behind on both security and features. Now let's talk about Linux. If you're not already familiar with it, get ready, because this one might surprise you. Linux is not a single operating system. It is a family of operating systems, all built on the same foundation called the Linux kernel. That kernel was originally created by a Finnish computer science student named Linus Torvalds back in 1991. He released it for free, openly, so anyone could use it and modify it. And that open nature is what makes Linux so unique. It is not owned by any single company. It is maintained by thousands of developers and organizations scattered across the entire planet. Because of that open structure, Linux comes in many different versions called distributions, or distros. Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch Linux, Linux Mint, Pop. OS, these are all Linux, all sharing the same core, but each with a different look, different tools, and a different target audience. Ubuntu is usually recommended for beginners, Arch Linux is for advanced users who want total control, and Linux Mint is designed to feel immediately familiar to people coming straight from Windows. On the global desktop, Linux still holds a relatively small slice, somewhere in the 3 to 4.5% range through most of 2026, depending on the month and the tracker, with StatCounter clocking it as high as 4.36% in June, close to its all-time recorded high. But that number is misleading in two big ways. First, Linux quietly powers almost everything else in modern computing. Something like 96% of the world's top 1 million web servers run Linux. Android, which runs on the overwhelming majority of the world's smartphones, is built directly on the Linux kernel. The supercomputers processing weather predictions, financial trades, and scientific research, nearly all of them run Linux. So while it looks tiny on the desktop chart, Linux is genuinely the backbone of the internet and of modern computing as a whole. Second, Linux desktop usage has been climbing steadily, and in 2026, unusually fast. Valve's own Steam hardware survey put Linux gamers at close to 4% of Steam's active user base by mid-2026. And with Steam's monthly active user base numbering well over 100 million, that works out to somewhere around 5 million people gaming on Linux every single month. Valve's own handheld device, the Steam Deck, runs a Linux-based operating system called SteamOS. And inside Steam's own Linux numbers, Valve's SteamOS build actually leads the pack of Linux distributions being used to play games. All of that is powered by Proton, Valve's compatibility layer that lets Windows games run on Linux. And Proton has gotten good enough that a large majority of the most played titles on Steam are now officially verified or at least playable on Linux. Natively on Linux, you will not find an official version of Adobe Photoshop or Microsoft Office, though excellent alternatives exist. GIMP for photo editing, LibreOffice for documents, and you can run Office through a browser if you need to. If you are dependent on very specific Windows or Mac software for your work, Linux can create friction. Hardware compatibility has also improved dramatically over the years, but is still not flawless. Most modern laptops work fine, though certain Wi-Fi cards, touchpads, or graphics setups can still cause the occasional driver headache. So where does this leave us? You have heard the full picture on all three. Now let me give you the real answer. If you are a gamer, and gaming is your primary use case, you want Windows. Not because Windows is technically superior in every category, but because the library is there, DirectX. Developer support is there, and anti-cheat systems generally work there without a fight. Linux gaming has come a long way, and the Steam Deck alone has proven it is genuinely viable, but for zero friction, maximum compatibility gaming right now, Windows is still the platform to beat. If you are a creative professional, a video editor, a music producer, a designer, and you can afford the hardware, you want a Mac. The combination of Apple Silicon performance, macOS stability, and the quality of apps like Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro, and the Adobe Creative Suite running natively on M-series chips is genuinely the best creative computing experience available anywhere right now. Final Cut Pro alone, which is Mac exclusive, is used by professional editors worldwide for its speed and reliability, and the battery life you get on a MacBook Pro while running these intensive apps is something Windows laptops simply cannot match yet. If you are a developer, a programmer, or someone working in tech, Linux is exceptional. The command line tools, the package managers, the native Unix environment, everything you need as a developer is either already built in or a single command away. A lot of professional developers who work on Mac are actually leaning on the fact that macOS is a Unix-based system similar to Linux under the hood, but Linux gives you that same environment for free. with more control and no hardware restrictions at all. If you are an everyday user, browsing the internet, watching videos, writing documents, maybe handling spreadsheets and email, and your priority is simplicity and reliability, macOS is wonderful if you can afford it. But Linux Mint or Ubuntu is also a very serious option, especially if you are on older hardware or you care about your privacy. It is free, it is stable, and for basic day-to-day tasks, it works beautifully. If you are on a tight budget and need a capable machine without spending a lot, Windows is probably your starting point simply because the hardware options are so varied. But keep in mind, a cheap Windows laptop often ships with a slow processor, not enough RAM, and a spinning hard drive, and it will feel sluggish fast. A mid-range Windows laptop with an SSD and at least 8 gigabytes of RAM gives you a much better experience. Or, alternatively, grab that old laptop collecting dust in a closet and put Linux on it. You will be surprised how well it runs. Now let me address the question people always ask at the end of these comparisons. Which one is the most secure? In terms of raw security, the general order goes Linux first, macOS second, Windows third. Linux benefits from its open source nature and its smaller desktop user base. Fewer desktop users means less. Financial incentive for hackers to target it specifically. And the open source code means vulnerabilities tend to get found and patched quickly by a global community of developers watching the codebase. macOS benefits from Apple's tight control over both hardware and software. And Apple has a fairly good track record of patching vulnerabilities quickly, though certainly not a perfect one. Windows, being the most popular by a wide margin, faces the most attacks by sheer volume. That does not automatically make Windows dangerous if you keep it updated and stay careful. But statistically, Windows machines face more malware threats than Mac or Linux, and that October 2025 end of support deadline made that gap even more dangerous for anyone who has not moved off Windows 10 yet, because every unpatched security hole discovered from that day forward simply sits there, wide open, on every device that never made the jump. In terms of privacy, Linux wins clearly. macOS is decent. Apple has made privacy a genuine public selling point and introduced features like app tracking transparency, but Apple still collects diagnostic data and maintains deep integration with services that gather usage information. Windows is the weakest of the three for privacy out of the box, with telemetry running by default, your experience tied to a Microsoft account, and heavy integration with Microsoft's advertising and data ecosystem. You can turn a lot of that off, but you have to go looking for those settings. They are not handed to you up front. Let me also talk about updates and longevity, because this matters enormously if you are buying a computer today and want it to actually last. Microsoft has committed to supporting Windows 11 through October 2031, which is a solid runway on paper. But the Windows 10 situation is a fresh reminder that Microsoft can and does cut off older hardware without much warning. If you bought a computer in 2018 and it cannot officially run Windows 11 because of the TPM requirement, you are now living through exactly that scenario. Your operating system is losing support, and your only paid lifeline runs out entirely by October 2027. Apple typically supports Macs for around 7 years. With software updates, a Mac bought in the late 2010s has already been cut off from the newest macOS releases, which is a reasonable lifespan, but does mean you should factor in that even an expensive Mac will eventually need replacing. Linux distributions, by contrast, offer long-term support versions that receive security updates for 5 years or more, and because Linux runs on nearly any hardware, there is no artificial cutoff point where your machine suddenly gets left behind just because the new release does not support your CPU generation. One more practical thing worth covering, file systems and interoperability, because this is something people never think about until it becomes a genuine problem. Windows uses NTFS, macOS uses APFS, Linux typically uses XT4. Plug a USB drive formatted on Windows into a Linux machine and it will work. Plug it into a Mac, it will also work, reading and writing without issue. But format a drive in macOS using APFS and plug it into a Windows computer, and Windows cannot read it natively at all. That kind of compatibility friction is very real, especially if you work across multiple systems or regularly share drives with other people. On the software ecosystem side, Windows has the largest overall software library, full stop. macOS has the most tightly curated, highest quality software. The App Store review process is strict, and developers tend to polish Mac apps more as a result. Linux has an enormous amount of free and open source software available through package managers, APT on Ubuntu-based systems, DNF on Fedora, letting you install thousands of programs with a single typed command, often faster than a typical Windows installer wizard even finishes loading its welcome screen. So let me wrap this up the way I started, with the question that actually matters: which one is right for you? You are a gamer, Windows. You are a creative professional who edits video, produces music, or works professionally in design, Mac with Apple Silicon. You are a developer or someone working in technology, Linux or Mac, depending on whether you need proprietary tools day to day. You are on a tight budget, Windows on mid-range hardware, or Linux on basically anything you already own. You care about privacy above everything else, Linux. You are already deep in the Apple ecosystem, iPhone, iPad, AirPods, Mac. You need to run one specific piece of software that only exists on one platform. Use that platform. The decision is already made for you. I made my choice. After going through all three seriously, testing each one as my actual daily driver for weeks at a time, I landed on a Mac for my main creative and production work. And I keep a Linux machine running for development and for anything privacy sensitive. Windows is still on my list, mostly for testing and for gaming. The truth is, heading through 2026, all three are genuinely capable operating systems. The argument is no longer about which one works and which one does not. They all work, and they all work well. The argument now is about which one works best for your specific life, your specific needs, and your specific budget. And I have given you everything you need to make that call for yourself, without spending months bouncing between 3 different machines the way I did before I finally landed on an answer. If you found this helpful, share it with someone who is stuck in the same debate, especially if they are one of the millions of people still sitting on an unsupported copy of Windows 10 right now trying to figure out their next move. And subscribe if you have not already, because there's a lot more coming on this channel that you are not going to want to miss. Drop a comment below and tell me which OS you are using and whether this video changed your thinking even a little. I read every single one.